On this edition of Let's Explore This, you will be taken into one of the many North Shore communities that once existed prior to a big lake called Fontana having been formed. There was this town, situated a bit northwest of where today this road, the so called Road to Nowhere, comes to a dead end. A full on discussion of this road, the Road to Nowhere, however, is beyond the scope of this episode. It does need to be mentioned briefly insofar as it relates to the town to be discussed on this episode. You see, this road, it dead ends right here at this tunnel. On this episode, we are going to be hiking beyond that tunnel, a good 3 to 4 miles to or close to a former town site, most of which I am going to assume is buried beneath that big lake. Yes, you will be seeing that big lake. Well, a part of it, the part that is closest to that former town site. What lies elsewhere is beyond the scope of this particular episode. That town site, by the way, was once called Forney.
Okay, folks, we are in this tunnel. Don't you just love the echo? I know I do. Tunnels are awesome. And it's a fairly long one. Let's get on with our episode.
Through a collection of photos and sites that revolve around what was once along this trail, you will, on this episode, be treated to a historical sketch of that town. Before we do begin this rather long tour, it should be noted that I have only a select few photos. Furthermore, this is a revised edition. Originally, it was done around 2020. Some of this came from physical sources that I, at the time of this revision, do not have access to. These days, I usually show more source material during the episode. Here, it is possible that some items may not be shown. I just do not have the time to redo that kind of research. With that out of the way, let me just say that I doubt you will be seeing any remnants of that town. However, most of its structures are said to have been buried beneath that lake. Now, it is quite possible that cabins and other structures were, at one time, located in the nearby area through which I will be hiking. Their remains, though, are likely long gone, but who knows?
Okay, folks, we are getting closer to the end of the tunnel. We have to go all the way through this tunnel and about 5 miles to reach our most prominent destination, because there are a couple of other sites nearby, very nearby actually, that we will also have to cover. So, see you on the other side of this tunnel. And here I am on the other side of this tunnel. Okay, folks, we have arrived at the little junction right here on our trek to our destination of Forney. As you can see, what we have here is Gold Mine Loop Trail, which is right over there. We have to keep following Lakeshore Trail, which is right over there. Now, our destination is Forney Creek Trail, which is 2.3 miles. So it's not a huge amount of distance, but you have to remember, I do have to come back 3 miles up and 3 miles back. And we have reached another junction. This one, well, we've got a sign here. We're still on Lakeshore Trail, Forney Creek Trail is still a mile to go yet, and we do need to reach that destination. Before we begin to talk about Forney, but it looks like we have arrived at something called, White Oak Branch Trail. We're not exploring that one, folks.
What you are looking at right now is the Google Earth image of the location of Clingman's Dome. Why? Well, because that is where the origins of Forney Creek lie, high up in the mountains of what is the highest point of what is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Of course, the creek has several feeder streams coming into it on its way down to where it empties into the Tuckasegee River.
Uh, Folks, we have a bit of a problem. Okay, so we're at another junction. There's a trail that goes that way, and there's a trail that goes that way. And then we have over here Lakeshore Trail going that way, and Lakeshore Trail going that way. So like it rounds the bend, but then what goes straight? I hope these signs are correct. Interestingly, somebody broke them apart, or maybe they have chipped away from rotten wood over the years. I don't know, but other signs don't look like that. Maybe this one over here leads me to see what's going on. Lakeshore Trail, that way. So I'm going to assume by these signs that I'm supposed to go that way and pray on my life that I don't have to go that way. Just in case, though, I do have this little map here on my phone, and we know where that is because we've already passed White Oak Branch Trail. Now, I think we are right here, and it does show this making a bend, and then another trail does come in. But if that's the case, that is to the right. But if this trail does loop like that, that looks like it would be just a tad bit of a ways down that way, and not this one. At least, that's what it looks like to me. But anyway, it looks like we do have to round the trail. But then what goes this way? So we're just going to keep going this way on our way to our destination, and hopefully it's the right one. Okay, folks, I think we have arrived. Here's why. Because the trail meets a junction with, well, as the sign says right here, Forney Creek Trail. And I was just on Lakeshore Trail, which goes up that way. But I think you can hear it behind me. Over there, I imagine that is Forney's Creek. I think we have arrived at our destination, and now we can uncover its history.
This here is an ancient photo of the town of Forney, a town once located at the mouth of that very creek on the Tuckasegee River, about 12 miles west downstream from Bryson City. The village was located on a surveyor campsite established in 1835 by Major Daniel Monroe Forney of the War of 1812 fame. Well, one source does say that, but another kind of points to a different Forney. Let me explain. At the time this episode was revised, A couple of the online sources appear to have either been removed or have had their URLs changed, so I can't be entirely sure if those two sources regarding the name of Forney actually came from the Peter H. Prince papers. In order to find that out, I would have to travel back to Knoxville in person to view that specific collection. No time for that these days. Now, back to the origins of Forney. Firstly, the name Forney. It is quite prominent in the area. It was the name of both a long gone town and the surrounding township. The name also appears as an appellation given to geographical features, namely Forney Ridge and Forney Creek. Now, Forney Creek, you certainly will be seeing that sooner than later, but Forney Ridge? Well, if you want to know where that is, this tunnel right here was rammed through it. Now, to uncover the origins of Forney, we need to delve briefly into Cherokee history. In 1838, if you do not know, the United States government forced 16,000 Cherokee Indians out of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Some 4,000 died en route to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And why did the government do that? Well, mainly property ownership. Why else? Before we delve even further into that, I first need you to take a look at this Google Earth pic of Andrews Bald. You see, there is scant evidence, but a number of stories, apparently detailing of the possibility that a gold mine once existed near this region. It is a number of miles from Forney, but still in the watershed. Unfortunately, that is too far for me to go trekking. I have too much to cover as it is. Here's the thing, though. There is evidence to suggest a number of mines had been present in the area, though not exactly within close proximity to the town of Forney. For example, a copper prospect was located near Silersbald, at the very head of Forney Creek. One of these, the Silers Meadow Project, was opened circa 1904 by none other than Granville Calhoun. Another prospect, the Welch Prospect, was also said to have been in the immediate vicinity. But then we have this article from 1955, and it talks about a lost gold mine possibly being near Andrews Bald. Now, you can pause, zoom in, and do all that techie stuff. It's a really strange read that delves into Cherokee history and a very old but lost gold mine. To this day, nobody knows if it has ever existed, let alone having been able to pin down a location. Folks, go on your treasure hunt for a day and find the mine. As for me, I have to move on. On September 3rd of 1838, James Irwin, William A. Irwin, Thomas Jefferson Forney, and scores of other men from Burke County in North Carolina purchased thousands of acres of Cherokee land. Forney and the two Irwins together purchased 3,000 acres, and the sale, well, it was at the town of Franklin in Macon County. The land, however, would later become Cherokee County, of which Murphy came to be the county seat. Now, Thomas Forney, he was elected surveyor of Burke County in 1828. He volunteered as a soldier in the Indian removal. Thomas was the son of Jacob Forney, Jr., a Burke County planter and veteran of the American Revolution. Okay, So, yeah, Swain County, it was formed in 1871. Well, back in the early 1800s, this area had nothing to do with Swain. No, this area of the Smoky Mountains, believe it or not, were a part of Macon County. So, while Forney was surveying in the Smoky Mountains of then Macon County, he fell into a creek. This was near the fork of the Tuckasegee and Little Tennessee rivers. So, after he fell into this here creek, and yes, it was this one, Jacob Seiler yelled, "That's Forney's Creek." So, folks, according to that, the name Forney, it may first have been used to denote this here creek. Well, on November 23rd, 1849 deed mentions Forney's campsite on the Jesse Seiler Tract. This is the earliest reference to Forney's Creek, and in 1871 it became a part of Swain County. Then, on July 7th, 1873, the Forney's Creek Township was established, and it was bordered by the Little Tennessee and Tuckasegee River, the Noland Divide, and the Great Smoky Divide, all along the Tennessee and North Carolina state line. Still, though, it is said to be difficult in trying to determine when the first people settled along this here creek. Even the origin of the name Forney's Creek is only speculation. You see, Pete Prince, a local historian who has done extensive research on former Smoky Mountain communities, believes it was probably named for a Colonel Forney who, with Jacob Seiler, surveyed the Smokies in the early 19th century. However, he has not found conclusive evidence to connect Colonel Forney with the creek. When asked, most of the former residents interviewed offered some speculation on the name's origin. While the details of these speculations did greatly vary, it was commonly agreed that this here creek had been named for a man who at some point in the forgotten past had fallen in. Okay,
Somebody has got to tell me. This trail is littered with leaves. I mean, I don't think you can step a foot in most places along this trail without stepping on a leaf. So, somebody has to tell me, where's the man with the rake?
so when Swain County was established, a precinct was established on June 3rd, 1871 in the Deep Creek Township at the mouth of Forney's Creek. Really? Well, here's a map. Notice Junie Wank Falls on the right. That is Deep Creek. Notice Backcountry Camp number 74. That is Forney's Creek. Wow. So Deep Creek Township must have been like really large? What's going on here? Not sure. Maybe Forney's was once called Deep Creek. I don't know. Something seems a bit fishy here. Regardless, though, Forney's Creek probably began its life as a community around the time of the Civil War. In February 1872, a Baptist church was officially established in the new settlement of Forney's Creek by the elders James Merritt Smiley and A. Justice of the Valley River Baptist Association. In fact, religious life in Forney's Creek was centered around this very church. The church was affiliated with, as just said, the Valley River Baptist Association, a missionary Baptist congregation. This church, well, it was located down there somewhere at what was once the mouth of Forney's Creek, not all that far from the bank of the Tuckasegee River. As you can clearly see, this church was a quaint white clapboard chapel in the 19th century style. It had two doors, one for the women and one for the men. It has been said that the gender formality, however, was not observed. Men and women, therefore, I guess, went in whichever door they liked. And just outside of this church was the so-called swimming hole, a deep place in the creek where new members were baptized. As there were no city limits or natural boundaries around Forney's Creek, the church did define the community. If you went to this church, you were a part of the Forney community. The church overall, it drew its membership from a radius of several miles around the Forney settlement. Some even came from across the river to attend services at that church. As there was no ferry fording the river near Forney in the 1930s, some would have to walk to the river. They would then have to pull across in an old rowboat. Most members, however, did come from the many tributaries along the north shore of the river. Some of these tributaries included Goldmine Branch, Woody Branch, and Noland Creek. A reported celebration of the church's 15th anniversary on August 31st, 1876, suggested that a community of the faithful may have been active in Forney's Creek as early as 1861. Sunday school enrollment at Forney's Creek was reported to be 72 in 1876. That likely closely corresponds to the community's population at that time. It was William Bryson Cole who donated the church site. He largely furnished the building, and he was a deacon for 58 years. A pastor named Henry Hogue pastored the church for 29 years, and reportedly, the Forney's Creek congregation founded another church, the Pleasant Grove Baptist Church, on November 22nd, 1884. That church merged with the mother church 3 years later. So, folks, tell me, where was the Pleasant Grove Church? Well, not sure, but there is something I do need to say. Do not go asking me to show you the location of where Forney's Creek Baptist once stood. It was torn down prior to the creation of that lake you see right over there. There is, however, a local cemetery that I can show you. We will get into that a little bit later. Right now, though, in 1873, the village name officially became Forney's Creek, with the founding of Forney's Creek Township. It was shortened to Forney in 1903 to distinguish the village from the Upper Forney's Creek Community and School, 2 miles north. Now, folks, you do need to take a look at this map. You see up there, the village and post office were named Gee in 1902 for Merritt Augustus Gee, a millwright from Vermont. Gee? Huh. Oh, there is no doubt this village was often referred to as Gee Whiz. This Merritt Gee, he established a homestead on Forney's Creek within a stone's throw of the Tuckasegee River. Gee, he built sawmills, he built corn mills, he installed equipment for numerous persons, and he even built a large sawmill for himself. Yet Gee was, a well-respected businessman. His friends honored him. And so, when a post office was established on September 12th of 1902, at the mouth of this here Forney's Creek, it was named Gee. Then, in 1906, Gee, well, he got into some financial trouble with one of his neighbors. In a Justice of Peace court held in the Thomason General Store and Gee Post Office, a crowd gathered for the legal proceedings. Samuel Weston Monteith was awarded a $184.75 judgment against Gee. Oh, Guy, how terrible. Well, that judgment, it took Guy's house, barn, and all other properties except for such items as household goods, which were boxed up for shipment to Asheville. The sheriff, he was ordered to sell Guy's sawmill to satisfy Monteith's debt. That judgment, it was rendered on August 8th of 1906, and so Guy, he had been defamed and removed. Nobody seemed to have wanted their town to be named after someone defamed. So, on May 19th of 1908, the Guy post office was renamed to Forney. However, Guy, he was not exactly defeated. 7 years later, in 1915, he was back in Swain County to build the large-scale band mill at Oconolofty, now a part of Cherokee, for the Giselle and Richard Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Okay, so do you know who this is? No. Well, this is none other than Charles S. Grossman, an architect and early practitioner of historic preservation. He focused heavily on a number of structures within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, one of which was located near Slab Camp Branch. I would love to trek up there to see if it is still standing, likely not. But that is just too far. Besides, I have some photos of this one. Firstly, though, let me show you this excerpt. So, Charles Grossman, he said the following. On November 20th, while trying to locate one of the original turbines of the Mingus Mill, I inspected the Woody Mill near the mouth of Slab Camp Branch on Forney Creek. The walls are of split logs with about 1 foot of face and are in a fairly good state of preservation. The roof has fallen in. The burrs, tubwheel, hopper, etc. are intact. This mill was built in 1890 by W.T. Woody. It was used principally to grind meal for blockade or corn liquor stills. It was in continuous use until 1918 or 1920. In fact, being a tub mill, it was quite easy to hide. And this one, it was hidden on Slab Camp Branch off Forney's Creek. Reportedly, it was used at the time to grind corn for making illegal whiskey. Wow, illegal whiskey. Some nasty stuff going on up here in the mountains. Regardless, the Woody Mill, it is a fine example of the tub mill, which was actually very common at the time in the Great Smokies. Yes, this here, it is an actual interior shot of that very mill. The completeness of this mill and the fact that only 2 of these mills of this type remain on the North Carolina side of the park warrants the preservation of this mill. Okay, but that passage is from 1936. Tell me, is it still standing or is it long gone? As for me, I cannot seem to locate any evidence it still stands. If that is true, what a shame. Anyhow, we do have to move on, so. The first passenger train on the Richmond and Danville Railroad passed through Forney Creek in 1886. Well, that line, it became the Southern Railway in 1894. Forney was served by passenger rail service until the area was inundated by Fontana Lake in 1944. You know, though, train fare in later years was only 10 cents for the little over 12 miles to Bryson City. Reportedly, it did not matter how cheap it was. Still, most boys hoboed, meaning they failed to pay. Anyhow, moving on to this photo of the Welch family, one of the families in the Forney Creek area. Reportedly, One of them is Adelphus Welch, so long as the middle initial of Z, as stated in the document, is incorrect. Somehow, I suspect it might be. Well, he was, on June 28th of 1873, appointed the first postmaster of Forney's Creek. The post office name on May 4th of 1903, as said earlier, was changed to Forney. Then mail service in 1906, it was sent to Bushnell. Yet then, with the coming of a large lumber mill, Abraham S. Nichols was appointed postmaster, and John R. L. Cole was appointed on June 28th of 1909. 6 years after the lumber mill burned, of which I will get into later, the mail service was again moved to Bushnell. Apparently, Samuel Goldman Monteith was appointed postmaster in April 6th of 1936, but the service, well, on October 30th of 1937, it was once again sent to Bushnell. Moving on now to this photo here of Callie Cole and her son, another one of the families that once inhabited the Forney Creek area. And this here is a photo of what is listed as having once been their home. You know, though, the population for years averaged about 100. In 1908, over 1,000 persons lived between Forney and Clingman's Dome when the Norwood Lumber Company went into operation. Overall, the period of 1900 to 1945 was one of cataclysmic changes for the people of the Smoky Mountains. The arrival of the logging industry early in the period drastically altered the region's economy. Small subsistence farming communities rapidly expanded into timber boom towns, but by the mid 1920s, many of the region's timber companies had almost exhausted their holdings in the Smokies. Around the turn of the century, two land speculators, Charles Joseph Harris and W. H. Woodbury, acquired a 17,000-acre on Forney's Creek. In 1906, this tract was purchased by the Norwood Lumber Company, and that company, it had been chartered in West Virginia by 5 men, 3 from West Virginia and 2 from Kentucky. Early in 1910, Norwood began laying the railroad track that would eventually be used to haul millions of board feet of timber from the mountains around Forney Creek. And in the winter of 1910, logging operations began on Slab Camp Branch, a small tributary that enters Forney Creek at about 3.5 miles from where it enters Fontana Lake. Since I do not have the time to trek up there, this map will show you where it is. Now, because locomotives were unable to tackle many of the steep grades in the mountains surrounding Forney Creek, Norwood made use of several cable inclines. These inclines were used to pull cars up the steep grades and then slowly let them down after they have been loaded. And all that motive force for the incline, it was provided by a large steam engine commonly called a steam donkey. It was operated at the top of the incline. It has been said that there were at least 4 such inclines operating on Forney's Creek at the time. This here is a photo of one such incline on Bear Creek, and there was also one on Ad Valorem Branch, one on Chokeberry Branch, and of course, one on this here, the main Forney Creek. In addition to the inclines, Norwood ran 3 Climax locomotives, of which this here is a photo. It is said that the Climax locomotives were often used due to their ability to handle the steep grades and sharp curves. People said that a Climax was so good on bad track that it would follow 2 lines scratched in the dirt. Of course, while that claim might be a bit of a mild exaggeration, it has been pointed out that the climax locomotives, or black satchels as they were often called, often did operate under very rugged conditions. Frequently, the trains would be driven into the woods on wooden rails as an expedient maneuver until steel rails could be fetched and laid. The method Norwood used in logging Forney Creek was typical for lumber operations in the region. A woods crew of about 30 men would set up a camp, usually a crude wood framed building, near the site to be logged. Such a camp usually employed 2 or 3 people to cook, take care of the living quarters, and tend to the draft animals. Then there was the timber crew. They would move into the woods, where they would cut all the trees of usable size, using axes and crosscut saws. A road crew would follow behind, building roads so that the horses could be brought in to pull out the logs. And the logs, they would be dragged out by a skidding team, using draft animals or, after 1913, a steam-powered skidder, as shown in this photo. Here is a photo of an old Forney skidder crew, and they would be pulled to a landing next to the railroad track. At that landing, the logs would be loaded onto cars using a drop-out rig and a steam-powered crane known as an American loader. And after the timber crew harvested all the usable timber around a tributary, the camp was dismantled, and the crew, they just moved up the creek to the next site, beginning it all over again. Though, loggers in the early 1900s earned around 65 cents for a 10-hour day. By the 1920s, wages had risen to about $1 a day. Wages for the wood crews did include meals and lodging. While many of the loggers worked for Norwood, several did roam from job to job, and these taxi squatters were commonly known as wood hicks. Many of them wore large, flappy brimmed hats. There was, however, a method to this hat madness. You see, for each day they worked, they would cut a notch in the brim, and when it came time to be paid, they would present their hat at the company office. They would collect their pay for the indicated number of days, and then trim the notches from the brim. This process sometimes continued until there was little left but the crown of the hat. Now, not sure if this is a photo of such a building, but Norwood built company housing on the hills around the main village. Boardwalks were built beside Forney's Creek, and I doubt they had amusement parks like you might find today along the ocean. But the company boarding house, it was said to face the creek and the mill pond. Of course, all of that is gone today. Still, though, you can look around and gaze at the hills. Who knows? Maybe, just maybe, one of those hills once held company housing. But we're not done yet. Furthermore, Norwood, it ran 2 commissaries for its workers, neither of which do I have a photo of. Regardless, it is said that there was one in the main town of Forney, and the other, well, we will not be going there. Here's why. It was located a number of miles up on Jonas Creek, then known as the Left-Hand Prong, at a place called the Junction. And the company, it would issue credit in the form of tokens to workers who wanted to purchase items in the commissary. That credit, it would later be subtracted from their pay. There was yet another store in Forney that I do not have a photo of. It was privately owned by John Cole. He, at that time, also ran the post office. John Cole's store, however, sold mostly dry goods, whereas the commissary is said to have been a kind of everything store. Now, I think it's time to move on to discuss a bit about what kind of wood was processed here at Forney's Creek. The Norwood Lumber Company of West Virginia. It located a large band mill here at Forney in 1908. It operated here for 17 years. Small gauge railroads were constructed up most watersheds, including a little over 11.5 miles on the side of Clingman's Dome. At 6,643 feet, Clingman's Dome is the highest peak in what is today the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Yes, folks, this here, Forney's Creek. It is one of the creeks that drains Clingman's Dome. Yes, the Forney Creek watershed. It is that big. Well, in 1910, Norwood established Clingman's Dome Logging Camp number 15, which you are looking at, to reach the timber over and all but nearly an impossible terrain. The narrow gauge railroad came within ninth of a mile of Clingman's Dome. On this highest point in the region, the railroad incline behind the smokestack lowered cars filled with logs 1.5 miles to a standard gauge railroad at the Forney Cascades. Now, fire destroyed that camp in 1925. Artifacts today are said to be scattered throughout the area. Now, I do not recall how old this photo is. It's likely from the early to mid 1900s. So, folks, if and when you take a hiking trek up to and about Clingman's Dome, you need to tell me, have you ever come across the lost remains of some long forgotten logging camp? Hey, wait, I've got a photo. Here is what is said to be a Norwood shovel near that area. Regardless, though, raw logs, they were delivered to the mill at the mouth of Forney's Creek. There they were cut, planed, and processed for shipment by rail. And in those early years, Norwood was interested primarily in hardwoods, which they made into flooring. With the advent of World War I, however, the demand shifted to lighter wood for use in the construction of airplanes and ships. But that's not even the gist of it. You see, Norwood moved to its spruce and balsam groves at the higher elevations. At one time, Norwood was estimated to have 30 million board feet of spruce on the stump. At the end of World War I, it was estimated that the average cut of spruce had been about 15,000 feet per acre. Now, folks, if you do not know, the forested area around Clingman's Dome consists heavily of a spruce fir forest. With that said, during the heyday of lumbering and sawmills, Forney had 4 passenger trains daily. They ran from Asheville to Murphy. There were also 3 freight trains, with one being called the Fontana, that took care of branch lines to Hazel Creek and Fontana. It hauled lumber and copper ore from the mines. In those years, well, they were the boom years for Forney's Creek. You see, more than 1,000 persons lived on Forney's Creek during the Norwood logging days from 1908 to 1925. By the way, this here very incline was located along this here creek, Bear Creek, beside which I am now walking. Yes, folks, this one so happens to be close enough that I did actually have the time to get to it. Cool, huh? Now, this one here, it was an incline machine in the Clingman's Dome area. But, folks, about Bear Creek, that is not all there was in that vicinity. Oh no, 'cause this Grossman guy, he loved to take photos of historic structures. And in 1938, he shot a pic of this, the Watson House. Where was that, might you ask? Well, it says, from the northeast, from the mouth of Bear Creek. What you are looking at right now is a pic of a Model T Ford. Why would I show you that, might you ask? Well, the first automobiles that came to Forney came from Judson, up Grassy Branch, across the mountain, to what would become the Wilderness Marina. They were then put on a ferry boat and brought over just above Goldmine Branch. But why this photo, you still might be asking? Well, most of the automobiles of that time were Model T Fords, prior to the construction of Highway 288. What we have here is a photo of a swinging bridge. This one is in Epps Springs, but don't worry about that. You see, there must have been one that crossed the Tuckasegee River somewhere down that way, I guess. Reportedly, it collapsed on September 22nd of 1911. It has been reported that a loose board came loose and killed James Merritt LaQuire.
What have we come upon here? It looks like a bridge. Could this be Grey Wolf Creek? It's possible. It's got enough water in it to be a creek. Usually a branch is even smaller than this. So, we might have come upon Grey Wolf Creek. However, folks, over in this vicinity we have a bit of a problem. You see, some doofus left their Gatorade bottle right over here.
Now, folks, I need to turn your attention to this. What we have here is a sketch of where the schools in Forney were once located, but you can forget about reaching the location of Forney's school. If its remains were still present, you would need scuba gear. That, folks, I do not have. The other two schools, though, well, their locations look a bit more promising to come by, I guess. Education was very important to the residents of Forney's Creek. During the course of its history, there were 3 schools in the vicinity. The first was an old log schoolhouse on what was then called Schoolhouse Branch. It was just below the site of this here woody cemetery. Before there was a school on Forney's Creek, some had walked more than 3 miles to go to school, all the way to Bushnell, the nearest sizable community.
Just below the site of Woody Cemetery, huh? Well, I am on kind of the start of that trail going up to that cemetery. And over here, we do come across a large opening. Now, another source says that the school was located at the junction of where Grey Wolf Creek, Woody Branch, Schoolhouse Branch. I mean, how many names can a creek possibly get? It seems different people, possibly from different eras, called it different things. A school was on it, Schoolhouse Branch. Woody was in the area, Woody Branch. And sometime later, the Geological Board or whatever decided to call it Grey Wolf Creek, Grey Wolf Branch, whatever. But where was the location of that school exactly? We do have a large opening here. They threw across a long stretch of picnic tables. I mean, Was this the area the school was located? I mean, it's definitely got enough clearing for a building to have existed at one time. Or was it, as that map I showed you much earlier showed, was it at the junction of Gray Wolf Creek and Forney's Creek, which is now buried beneath the lake? This is somewhat of a mystery. But anyway,
Around the turn of the century, however, that old log schoolhouse was replaced by a new school. It was located at the junction of Forney's Creek and Woody's Branch.
now, folks, you might be thinking, Gray Wolf Creek, Woody's Branch, are they the same thing? Well, I'm going to get into that. But right now, let me just say that Woody's Branch or Gray Wolf Creek or I don't know, whatever name you want to give it. Well, the junction of this branch in Forney's Creek, well, take a look at this map. That junction is kind of buried beneath the lake. So, we won't really be able to get to that junction.
The official name of Woody Branch was changed to Gray Wolf Branch by the United States Geological Survey in June of 1932. The school that once did exist on Woody Branch, though, was a one-room schoolhouse heated by a big pot-bellied stove. Elmer Woody, who left Forney Creek in the 1930s, recalled going to school early in the morning to start the fire before the other students arrived. In the school, it provided education through the 7th grade for about 20 students. Well, Forney School, it was established on July 2nd of 1917 for the children who, lived near the lumber mill. Prior to its founding, pupils had to walk about a mile and a half up Forney's Creek to Woody School. Reportedly, though, that third school, it closed down in 1925 after the historic mill fire, which will be discussed soon. Now, the Norwood Lumber Company, it gave half an acre next to Forney's Creek Missionary Baptist Church for the school. Due to the small number of pupils, Forney, along with nearby Noland, their schools were closed on February 8th of 1940 and consolidated into this school in Bushnell. Yes, folks, I do have a few but very limited photos of Forney structures. None of the schools, however, are among them. With that said, it turns out that in 1927, Highway 288 reached Forney. It was the first and only good road in the area. Now, I think it is a good time for a brief discussion of a couple of people who once inhabited the area. First off, we have William Pinky Thomason. He was the manager of the Norwood Company's large commissary. Next up, we have William Thomas Cole. He was the only person on Forney's Creek to have electricity. He reportedly ran a power plant off a 6-foot water wheel. Let's now move on to a few stores that were once located here in Forney. There were a few, though I have a photo of only one. Before we get to that, however, there was John R. L. Cole, who, as mentioned earlier, is said to have operated a general store. At one time, D. G. Fisher, Stovall, and Woody had stores in town, but the store I have a photo of was none of those. It was the one operated by John Monteith. It existed until the area was flooded by the Fontana Reservoir in 1944. Interestingly, though, there was another Monteith, George Monteith, who lived in Forney. Well, he climbed 20 miles up this here Forney Ridge, all the way to the top of the Smokies to reach Newfound Gap. From there, he watched Franklin Delano Roosevelt dedicate the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on September 2nd of 1940. Later, he was invited back to the 50th anniversary on June 15th of 1984. But I rode this time, he reportedly said. His closing remark was, wished Roosevelt had stayed in Washington. Such a remark of support, if that is in fact what it was, would be sort of interesting. It was during the Roosevelt administration that the Tennessee Valley Authority took the Monteith Farm for the Fontana Reservoir in 1944. Usually, if somebody feels they are negatively impacted by a federal decision, his or her support for the president often diminishes. Not always, though. Besides, Roosevelt, he was kind of unlike any other president that came before and even after.
Look what I found, folks. A tree branch sticking high overhead above the trail. Wow. And it looks like I will have to walk under it. Anyhow, back with our regularly scheduled programming.
It has been reported that Monteith wore overalls in 1940 to see the president, then, yet again, he wore them to the 50th anniversary celebration. At that time, he was a guest of the park. Monteith, at the age of 90, was laid out in a new pair of overalls when he died on February 8th of 1989. Now, it is time to bring your attention to the lumber mill. You see, Norwood's operations had a major setback, probably about 1925, when a fire swept through the dry kiln and mill at Forney, and it destroyed the entire complex. There appears to be differing accounts as to whether the company ever rebuilt. While the 1928 Southern Lumbermen's Directory of American Sawmills and Planing Mills reported that Norwood had a band sawmill, edger, trimmer, dry kiln, and electric light plant. It was cutting ash, basswood, beech, birch, buckeye, cherry, chestnut, hemlock, maple, oak, poplar, and spruce. Other accounts, however, state that most operations ceased after the fire. Whatever the case, it is clear that by the late 1920s, the mill was moved to East LaPorte in Jackson County. There, the firm operated as the Blackwood Lumber Company. After this very fire, the town of Forney, it dwindled. Many of the timber and mill workers followed Norwood to East LaPorte. Others went to work for other companies in nearby counties. Several, they even went out of state to find work. Those who stayed on were mostly natives to the area who went back to subsistence farming. They were also reported to scavenge jack pine and acid wood. It has even been said that Norwood attempted to convert part of the old lumber mill into a corn mill for a short time. Interestingly, one resident once reported the following. They put a corn mill in the planing mill and ground meal. They put it on the market. I remember the name of it was Forney Creek Fresh Ground Meal. Soon, however, the school in the mill town was closed, and there were only about a dozen families left in the community. Not long after, things were about to take a drastic turn. You see, while the Forney Creek watershed was cruised prior to acquisition for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it had just about been almost completely clear cut. A 1928 valuation reported that only 12,300,000 board feet of timber remained, with a value of $104,000. The report stated that the 17,000-acre property also held 1,000 acres of orchard and farmland with 1,200 apple trees. Reportedly, 1,500 acres had been burned from railroad spark fires. Regardless, though, in its heyday, during the timber boom of the teens and 20s, estimates of the population at Forney Creek run as high as 1,000 to 1,500, however. Just prior to the creation of this here Fontana Reservoir, as just stated, there were only about a dozen families remaining. Nonetheless, many of the families had several generations of history along this here creek, and so leaving the community they had known all their lives, it was very difficult. As the timber industry left the Smokies, so did many of the people. Some left to find work, while others were forced to leave to make room for the new park. In fact, the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park directly resulted in the displacement of hundreds of small communities within its boundaries. Outside of the park, however, on a narrow strip between the southeastern boundary of the park and the Tuckasegee and Little Tennessee rivers, Forney's Creek was one of a number of communities that survived into the 1940s. That is, until this big lake was created. Now, folks, this is not like one of those Great Lakes. No, this thing is man made. You see, in December of 1941, the Tennessee Valley Authority announced plans for the construction for the Fontana Dam and Reservoir. The creation of the reservoir required only about 12,000 acres, but in a controversial decision, the authority acquired an additional 43,000 acres on the north shore of the reservoir and transferred them to the park. Of course, this brought an end to the many communities that once lined the north bank of the Tuckasegee and Little Tennessee rivers. Well, one of those communities, as you should now be able to infer, was none other than Forney's Creek. Interestingly, though, not long before the thought of the dam, on June 30th of 1932, the United States Geographic Board changed Forney's in the national park to just Forney without the S. As you should be able to infer, the much bigger township did hold the town of Forney within its borders. Forney Township, however, is not the same as the town of Forney. Today, though, Forney's Creek is a common destination for hikers in the park. Hiking in from the east on this here Lakeshore Trail, it can be difficult to imagine that people once lived here and farmed this land. Many hikers coming through here likely have no idea. Indeed, it can be difficult to imagine how anyone happening on this place, when it was still virgin wilderness, could have thought it would be a suitable place to start a farm and raise a family. Yes, water is plentiful, with small branches and springs at virtually every turn in the trail. Still, the terrain is rugged and rocky. The mountains, they shoot almost straight up in the trail. There are occasional hollows, but otherwise very few flat plots. At times, though, a curious hiker will turn off the main trail onto a Park Service road that leads up the mountain not far from Forney's Creek and be surprised to stumble onto this well kept cemetery. Yes, it is the Woody Cemetery discussed a bit earlier.
An interesting thing about this cemetery, though, is there is a whole section in what appears to be even more well kept than some of the other sections that is devoted not entirely, because there are some down there that do not apply, but at least a large section, maybe even a little over half, is dedicated to infants. All of these over here, for example, are all infants I guess their last name was Freeman. Whoever that was, and I don't think it was Morgan, by the way, whoever that was must have had a lot of infants. I guess a bunch of them died. I'm not certain as to the reasons behind that.
Even without making the steep trek up to this woody cemetery, finding signs of former life on Forney's Creek is not too difficult for those who are attentive. Okay, folks, what I am about to read, because yes, this does come from a few different documents, this describes things I do not have the time to go searching for. I cannot even be sure if the stuff mentioned is still present. Maybe it is, maybe not. If I see something, well, you will see it. If not, well, trek up here one day and see if you can find things for yourself. Who knows what you will be finding up here? My time, folks, yes, it is very limited. Apparently, though, with a little poking around, you might just uncover many reminders of Forney Creek's former life. Items such as bed frames, old bottles, and other things are said to be buried in the brush.
Old bottles. Huh. Well, there was that old Gatorade bottle that you saw much earlier. I mean, could that have been from that bygone era?
There is, reportedly, even an iron clawfoot bathtub that sits near the junction of Forney Creek and Bee Gum Branch, at the site of a former Civilian Conservation Corps camp. Is it still there today? I don't know. They say it's a beautiful area. I just do not have the time to go all the way up there. Bee Gum Branch would be 16 miles round trip. Regardless, the camp, which operated in the 1930s, housed the young men who dug many of the trails in the park. Walking along the creek, though, it is said one can find rail segments, pieces of train coupling, and other pieces of a bygone era. Reportedly, train track segments can be found not far from the Proctor vicinity, a location that requires a boat ride across the lake. But what about here? Thomas Jefferson Forney, the man this creek is said to be named after, never lived on Cherokee land. He settled at El Dorado in Montgomery County. He was a wealthy planter, gold miner, and slave owner. His belief in the Confederate cause left him penniless following the Civil War. He is buried in the New London Cemetery in Stanley County. Overall, as with most other towns along the North Shore, Forney's Creek was a community with a value that cannot easily be accounted for in terms of the electricity generated by the Fontana Dam or in terms of the enjoyment experienced by park visitors. It was a community in which people and families had invested their lives. The sacrifice of the community should not be casually brushed aside as a trivial cost in the pursuit of progress.
Before we move on, however, I want to know, on my way back, I do not see the Gatorade bottle. Somebody has got to tell me, where did it go? Did somebody trek through here and pick it up, saw a little bit of litter, and made Trump an unhappy person? But wait, maybe not. What's that over there? Did it jump to the other side? No, wait a minute. That one's got stuff in it. That one's not empty. Oh, that's my bottle.